The warm sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the dusty police station lot. It was the kind of day that seemed to stretch endlessly, where time moved slower than it should. In the back corner, a group of officers leaned casually against their patrol cars, laughing loudly, their voices carrying across the empty expanse. Among them was a man they called Reggie. Reggie wasn't dressed like the rest of them. His khaki pants and crisp white shirt already showed signs of wear, dirt smudges on the knees, sweat stains spreading under the arms. He looked out of place, almost vulnerable. And that's exactly why they singled him out. "Hey, Reggie," one of the officers shouted, twirling a thick metal chain in his hand like a toy. The chain clinked and clanged, its sound sharp against the silence of the afternoon. "Let's see if you're fast enough to run with this." The group erupted into laughter. Reggie smiled awkwardly, trying to play along, but the unease in his eyes betrayed him. They were looking for sport, something to break the monotony of the day, and Reggie, with his quiet demeanor and unfamiliar face, had become their target. Before he could protest, they had him seated on the pavement. The chain, cold and heavy, was wrapped around his ankle and locked with a satisfying click. It wasn't a real ball and chain, just a scrap piece of metal they kept around for pranks. But to Reggie, it might as well have been. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to find a way to move without the chain cutting into his skin. The officers stood back, arms crossed, their faces lit with amusement. "All right, let's see you run now," another officer said, his voice dripping with mock encouragement. "Come on, Reggie. Show us what you've got." Reggie didn't move. For a moment, his expression changed, just for a split second. The easygoing smile faded, replaced by something harder, something unreadable. But it was gone before anyone could notice. He shifted the chain slightly, stood up, and met their laughter with a small, forced grin. "You think this is funny, huh?" Reggie asked, his tone light but his words carrying weight. The officers shrugged, not catching the edge beneath his question. "Oh, don't take it so seriously, man," one of them replied, smirking. "It's just a bit of fun." Reggie nodded slowly, brushing the dust off his pants. "Yeah," he said softly, "just a bit of fun." He didn't say much after that. He didn't need to. Because what they didn't know, what none of them realized, was that this so-called Reggie wasn't just some random guy they could mess with. He wasn't an intern, a rookie, or a passerby they could intimidate. This man, standing quietly before them with a chain around his leg, was about to change everything. The laughter echoed one last time as Reggie turned away, dragging the chain slightly as he walked. Each step left behind a faint scrape in the dirt, a sound the officers barely noticed, but one that would haunt them soon enough. And as the camera lingers on Reggie's retreating figure, the screen fades to black, leaving the audience with one burning question. Who is Reggie really? And what will he do next? As Reggie walked away, the sound of the chain dragging behind him filled the air like an awkward punctuation mark. The officers' laughter gradually died down, replaced by casual chatter about weekend plans and complaints about the heat. None of them seemed to think twice about what they had just done, or who they had done it to. Reggie kept moving, his steps slow and deliberate. The weight of the chain wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Every clink and scrape seemed to echo in his mind, bringing back memories he had long tried to bury. Memories of times when men like these, men in uniforms, had treated him as less than human. He clenched his jaw and reminded himself to stay calm. This wasn't the time. Not yet. He glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the group of officers who had returned to their casual stances. They weren't bad men, necessarily, not all of them, anyway, but they were careless, too comfortable in their assumptions about who he was and what they could get away with. That carelessness would cost them. The chain dragged a little harder as Reggie rounded a corner, disappearing from their sight. Once out of view, he stopped and took a deep breath. His mind raced, but his expression remained calm. Reggie had learned a long time ago how to control his emotions, how to keep his face neutral even when his heart was pounding. It was a skill that had served him well, especially in moments like this. He crouched down, examining the lock on the chain, It wasn't particularly sturdy. He could probably break it if he wanted to. But he decided against it. Let them think he was still shackled. Let them believe he was just a helpless man they could toy with. For now, he'd play their game. Reggie straightened up and began walking again, his pace measured and steady. He needed to clear his head, to figure out his next move. This wasn't just about what had happened today. It was about something much bigger. Something that had been building for months, maybe even years. A car engine roared to life nearby, snapping Reggie out of his thoughts. He turned to see one of the officers pulling out of the lot in a patrol car, his arm hanging lazily out the window. The officer didn't notice Reggie standing there, watching him with quiet intensity. He was too busy fiddling with the radio, oblivious to the fact that the man he had just humiliated was still within earshot. Reggie shook his head and kept walking, his thoughts drifting back to the events that had brought him here. He hadn't planned on visiting this particular precinct today. In fact, he'd hoped to avoid it altogether. But fate had a funny way of intervening. Earlier that morning, Reggie had received a call from a friend, a fellow officer from another department, who had warned him about the culture at this station. "It's a mess," his friend had said. "The guys there, they got no discipline, no respect. You should see it for yourself." Reggie had taken the advice to heart. He decided to show up unannounced, dressed in plain clothes, to observe the precinct without the filter of formal introductions or polished presentations. He wanted to see how the officers behaved when they thought no one important was watching. And now he had his answer. As he walked, Reggie's mind turned over the details of what he had witnessed. The jokes, the arrogance, the blatant disregard for basic decency. It all painted a troubling picture. This wasn't just a case of a few bad apples. It was a systemic problem, one that needed to be addressed immediately. But how? Reggie knew that confronting the officers directly wouldn't accomplish much. They'd dismiss him as a troublemaker, or worse, a liar. No, he needed to be strategic. He needed to find a way to hold them accountable without giving them the chance to cover their tracks. He stopped walking and looked around, taking in his surroundings. The lot was quiet now, the officers having retreated inside to the air-conditioned comfort of the station. Reggie could see their silhouettes through the windows, moving casually as if nothing had happened. The sight made his stomach churn. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a text from his assistant, reminding him of the meeting he had scheduled for later that afternoon, the meeting that would change everything. Reggie smiled faintly as he read the message. The chain around his ankle suddenly felt a little lighter. He knew that soon enough, the truth would come out. And when it did, the men inside that station would have to reckon with the consequences of their actions. But for now, Reggie stayed where he was, standing in the shadow of the building that symbolized so much of what was wrong with the system. He had no intention of storming in or making a scene. That wasn't his style. Instead, he'd wait. He'd bide his time, let the tension build, and then reveal the truth in a way that none of them could ignore. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the lot, Reggie turned and walked back toward the station. The chain still dragged behind him, its sound sharp and deliberate. He didn't bother trying to remove it. He wanted them to see him like this, shackled, underestimated. Because what they didn't realize was that the man they had humiliated wasn't just another passerby. He wasn't a rookie or an outsider. He was their boss, the new precinct commander who had been sent to clean up the mess they had made. And he was just getting started. The sun was sinking lower now, the shadows growing longer across the lot as Reggie approached the station. The sound of the chain dragging behind him felt louder in the quiet evening air, like a warning bell that only he could hear. He paused for a moment, looking at the building with its brick walls and weathered windows. It seemed ordinary from the outside, just another precinct in just another town. But inside, Reggie knew it was anything but ordinary. It was a place where complacency had turned into corruption, where unchecked power had fostered arrogance and neglect. Reggie's footsteps slowed as he neared the entrance. He could see through the glass doors that the officers were still inside, scattered in small groups, talking and laughing as if the day's events were nothing more than a passing joke. One of them, the officer who had locked the chain around Reggie's ankle, was leaning against the reception desk, his hands gesturing animatedly as he recounted the story to a colleague. Reggie could hear snippets of their conversation through the open door. "Man, you should have seen his face," the officer said, laughing. "He looked like he didn't know what hit him. Classic." The other officer chuckled, shaking his head. "You guys are wild. Don't let the brass catch wind of this, though. They've been breathing down our necks about complaints lately." Reggie's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral as he stepped through the door. The officers glanced at him briefly, their laughter faltering for a moment before they turned back to their conversation. They didn't recognize him, or, if they did, they didn't think he was worth acknowledging. He walked past them, the chain scraping against the floor with each step. The sound made the receptionist look up from her computer, her eyes widening slightly when she saw him. "Sir, can I help you?" she asked hesitantly, her gaze flickering to the chain around his leg. Reggie stopped and turned to her, his voice calm but firm. "Not yet," he said. "But you'll know when I need you." The receptionist blinked, unsure of how to respond, but Reggie didn't wait for her to say anything. He continued walking, heading toward the staircase that led to the second floor. He knew the layout of the building well, had studied the blueprints before taking the job. The staircase was narrow and dimly lit, the kind of space that seemed to absorb sound rather than amplify it. Reggie's footsteps were quiet now, the chain barely making a noise as he ascended. When he reached the top, he turned down a hallway lined with offices. Most of the doors were closed, but a few were open, revealing cluttered desks and bulletin boards covered in faded memos. He walked to the end of the hallway, stopping in front of a door with a plaque that read "Captain's Office." The door was slightly ajar, and Reggie could hear voices coming from inside. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was spacious but cluttered, with stacks of paperwork piled high on the desk and a coffee mug balanced precariously on top of one of the stacks. The man behind the desk, Captain Willis, looked up in surprise when he saw Reggie standing there. "Who are you?" Willis demanded, his eyes narrowing. "And what are you doing in my office?" Reggie didn't answer immediately. He stepped further into the room, letting the door swing shut behind him. The chain clinked softly as he moved, drawing Willis's attention to it. The captain's expression shifted from confusion to annoyance. "Is this some kind of joke?" Willis asked, his tone sharp. "I don't have time for this. If you're here to file a complaint, go through the proper channels." Reggie took another step forward, his eyes locked on Willis. "I'm not here to file a complaint," he said evenly. "I'm here to introduce myself." Willis frowned, his irritation growing. "Introduce yourself. What are you talking about?" Reggie reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge, holding it up for Willis to see. The captain's eyes widened as he recognized the emblem, the insignia of the state's Internal Affairs Division. Reggie's voice was calm, but there was a steely edge to it as he spoke. "I'm Reginald Parker," he said, "your new precinct commander, and we need to have a conversation about what's been going on here." Willis's mouth opened, then closed again. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but something in Reggie's expression stopped him. The captain sank back into his chair, his face pale. Reggie took a seat across from him, the chain on his leg clinking softly as he adjusted his position. He placed the badge on the desk between them, letting it sit there like a silent reminder of his authority. "You got a problem in this precinct," Reggie said, his tone measured but firm, "and I'm here to fix it." Willis swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting nervously on the desk. "Look, Commander Parker," he began, his voice shaky. "I don't know what you've heard, but—" Reggie held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save it," he said. "I've seen enough to know that this isn't just a case of a few bad apples. This is a culture problem, and it starts at the top. Which means it starts with you." The tension in the room was thick, the air heavy with unspoken accusations. Willis looked like he wanted to protest, but he didn't dare. Reggie's gaze was unwavering, his presence commanding. "We're going to change things around here," Reggie continued, "and we're going to start by holding people accountable. That includes you, Captain." Willis nodded slowly, his face grim. He didn't have a choice. Reggie's authority was absolute, and he knew it. Reggie leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The chain around his leg felt lighter now, almost unnoticeable. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for the challenge. This was his precinct now, and he wouldn't rest until it was a place of integrity and respect. But as he left the captain's office and made his way back downstairs, Reggie couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The officers who had humiliated him earlier didn't know who he was yet, and when they found out, the real battle would begin. Reggie walked back down the hallway, his footsteps echoing faintly against the tiled floor. The weight of the chain was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden. Now it was a reminder, a symbol of the work he had to do. He paused at the top of the staircase, looking down toward the main floor where the officers were still gathered. Their laughter drifted faintly upward, carefree and oblivious. For a moment, Reggie considered walking straight into their circle and announcing who he was. But he stopped himself. This wasn't the time for grand gestures. This required strategy. He turned instead and walked to an empty office near the end of the hall. The room was plain, with a simple desk, a few chairs, and a small window that overlooked the lot outside. Reggie stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for: Detective Harris. Harris was one of the few people Reggie trusted in situations like this. They had worked together in the past, investigating precincts where corruption had taken root. Harris was sharp, meticulous, and unafraid to dig deep, even when it meant making enemies. Reggie tapped the name and waited as the phone rang. Parker. Harris's voice came through the line, brisk and no nonsense. What's the situation? Reggie glanced out the window, watching as the patrol car from earlier pulled back into the lot. Worse than I thought, he said. The culture here is toxic. Arrogance, complacency, you name it. I've already had my own run-in with them, and they don't even know who I am yet. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Harris sighed. Let me guess. They tested you. Reggie smirked faintly. You could say that. Let's just say they've got a thing for ball and chain pranks. Harris let out a low whistle. Bold move. They're playing with fire and don't even realize it. They will soon enough, Reggie said. But I need your help. I want to go through their records. Everything from disciplinary reports to complaint logs. If there's a paper trail, I need to see it. I'm on it, Harris replied. But you know how this goes. If they've been covering their tracks, it's going to take time to find anything substantial. I know, Reggie said. Just start digging. In the meantime, I'll be working on the ground. I want to see how they operate when they think no one's watching. Got it, Harris said. Be careful, Parker. Places like that, they don't change easily. Reggie ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. He took a moment to steady himself, breathing deeply as he stared out at the horizon. The sun was almost gone now, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. It was a fleeting moment of peace before the storm. Downstairs, the atmosphere was still lively. The officers had regrouped in the break room, their voices blending into a steady hum of conversation. Reggie walked past the doorway, unnoticed, and made his way toward the holding cells. He wanted to get a feel for the space, to understand the environment where the people in their custody spent their time. The cells were dimly lit, their walls marked with graffiti and scuffs that told the story of countless occupants. Reggie walked along the row, his eyes scanning the names scratched into the paint, the messages left behind. Each mark was a reminder of the humanity that often went ignored in places like this. As he turned to leave, he heard a voice behind him. Hey man, what are you doing down here? Reggie looked over his shoulder and saw a young officer standing in the doorway. He recognized him from earlier, one of the quieter ones in the group. The officer's name tag read Dawson. Just taking a look around, Reggie said casually. Is that a problem? Dawson hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly. Not really. It's just, most people don't come down here unless they have to. Reggie studied him for a moment, noting the slight unease in his posture. Dawson wasn't like the others. He didn't have the same air of arrogance or the same sharp edges. He seemed unsure, like he wasn't entirely comfortable with the culture of the precinct. "Do you work down here often?" Reggie asked, keeping his tone conversational. Dawson shrugged. "Sometimes. It depends on the shift." "Why?" "No reason," Reggie said. "Just trying to get a feel for the place." Dawson nodded but didn't say anything else. Reggie could see the hesitation in his eyes, the internal struggle of someone caught between loyalty to his colleagues and discomfort with their behavior. It was a small crack in the wall, but it was something. Reggie filed it away for later, knowing that Dawson might be a useful ally when the time came. As Reggie made his way back upstairs, he thought about the layers of the conflict he was stepping into. This wasn't just about one incident or one group of officers. It was about a system that had been allowed to fester for too long, unchecked and unchallenged. It was about the people who had suffered as a result, their voices drowned out by a culture of silence and complicity. The next step would be crucial. Reggie needed to gather more information, to observe and listen without tipping his hand. He needed to understand the dynamics of the precinct, the alliances, the rivalries, the unspoken rules that govern their actions. Only then could he begin to dismantle the structures that had allowed this behavior to thrive. But as he walked through the quiet halls, the weight of the task ahead settled heavily on his shoulders. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Change never was, and the deeper he dug, the more resistance he was likely to face. Still, Reggie was determined. He had faced challenges like this before, and he knew that the key to success was patience and persistence. The officers might think they held all the power, but they were about to learn otherwise. The precinct hummed with the usual evening activity, but the energy had shifted. Reggie's quiet presence had begun to ripple through the department in subtle ways. Officers passed him in the hall with polite nods, their eyes lingering just a second too long. Some muttered quiet remarks under their breath, testing the waters to see if he'd react. He didn't. He remained composed, watching and listening, absorbing every detail like a sponge. They still didn't know who he was, but they could sense something was different. Reggie kept his routine unassuming, blending into the background as much as he could. He took his coffee in the break room, observed the daily patrol meetings from a corner, and made small talk with anyone willing to engage. But his mind was constantly working, piecing together the fragments of a bigger picture. There were patterns in their behavior, small tells that revealed the dynamics at play. He noticed who laughed the loudest at inappropriate jokes, who avoided eye contact when things got tense, and who walked on eggshells around certain officers. One night, as Reggie was locking up the office he had claimed as his own, he saw Officer Dawson lingering in the parking lot. The young officer was leaning against his car, his hands in his pockets, his expression thoughtful. Reggie hesitated, then decided to approach. "Dawson," Reggie called out, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Everything all right?" Dawson straightened up, startled, and looked at Reggie. For a moment, he seemed to wrestle with whether to speak, but then he nodded toward the empty lot. "Just needed some air," he said. "It gets heavy in there sometimes, you know." Reggie studied him, sensing the weight behind those words. "I know," he said. "Want to talk about it." Dawson hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know if it'll change anything," he admitted. "But yeah, maybe." They stood there for a moment, the night air cool and still around them. Dawson glanced toward the station, as if making sure no one was watching, before he spoke again. "It wasn't always like this," he said. "When I first joined, I thought I was making a difference. But after a while, it's like the system eats you alive. You see things you're not supposed to see. You hear things you wish you hadn't heard. And if you say something, you're the problem." Reggie nodded, letting Dawson's words sink in. "I get it," he said. "It's hard to stand up when it feels like everyone's against you. But sometimes the only way to change things is to take that first step." Dawson looked at him, his eyes searching. "You sound like you've been through this before." Reggie smiled faintly. "Let's just say I've seen my fair share of battles," he said, "and I'm not afraid of another one." Dawson's expression shifted, a mix of curiosity and caution. He didn't ask what Reggie meant, but Reggie could tell he was thinking about it. As they stood there in the quiet lot, Reggie felt a spark of hope. Dawson wasn't like the others. He was someone who could be reached, someone who could help. The next day, Reggie found himself back in the captain's office. Captain Willis was tense, his demeanor defensive as he sat behind his desk. Reggie could tell the man was on edge, aware that his authority was slipping away. "What's this about?" Willis asked, his tone clipped. Reggie placed a folder on the desk in front of him. "These are copies of the complaints filed against this precinct in the last 5 years," he said. "Excessive force, discrimination, abuse of power. The list goes on." Willis's face hardened. "Those complaints were investigated," he said, "and most of them were unfounded." "Most," Reggie repeated, raising an eyebrow. "But not all, and even the ones that were dismissed. Let's just say the circumstances are questionable. Too many coincidences. Too many patterns." Willis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What are you getting at?" "I'm saying that this precinct has a problem," Reggie said, his voice steady, "and it's my job to fix it, starting with accountability." Willis stared at him, his jaw tightening. "You don't know what you're getting into," he said. "This isn't some textbook case. These officers," Reggie interrupted, "are going to be held to the standards they swore to uphold. And if you can't handle that, Captain, then maybe you're part of the problem." The tension in the room was palpable, the air heavy with unspoken challenges. Willis didn't respond, but the look in his eyes was enough. He wasn't going down without a fight. As Reggie left the office, he knew he had just made an enemy, but he also knew it was necessary. The culture of the precinct was deeply ingrained, and changing it would require pushing back against the very people who had allowed it to flourish. It was a risk, but it was one he was willing to take. Later that night, Reggie sat at his desk, going over the notes Harris had sent him. The evidence was damning: patterns of misconduct, questionable practices, and a clear lack of oversight. But there was still more to uncover, and Reggie knew he was running out of time. The officers were starting to grow suspicious, their behavior shifting as they sensed the walls closing in. Reggie's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Harris. "Found something big. Call me ASAP." Reggie felt a surge of adrenaline as he grabbed his phone and dialed Harris' number. The detective answered on the first ring. "Parker," Harris said, his voice urgent. "I think I've found the missing piece. You're not going to believe this." But before Harris could finish, the line went dead. Reggie stared at his phone, his heart pounding. Something wasn't right, and whatever it was about to bring everything to a boiling point. Reggie stared at his phone, the sudden silence leaving an uneasy void. Harris's abrupt disconnection didn't feel like a technical glitch. Something about the tone of his last words made the hairs on Reggie's neck stand on end. He quickly tried to call back, but the line didn't even ring. It went straight to voicemail. A heavy sense of foreboding settled over him, the kind that only came from years of experience in situations where danger lingered just beneath the surface. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Harris had said he found something big, something that could be the key to the entire investigation. But now he was unreachable, and that wasn't a coincidence. Reggie knew he had to act fast. He grabbed his keys, locked up his office, and headed out. The precinct was quieter than usual, the late hour thinning the crowd to only a skeleton crew. Still, he moved carefully, keeping his expression neutral as he made his way to his car. Driving through the city streets, Reggie's mind replayed Harris's words over and over. What could he have found that would make him sound so alarmed? Harris wasn't one to rattle easily, and for the line to go dead like that, it wasn't just suspicious, it was chilling. Reggie's first stop was Harris' office. He knew the detective often worked late, and if he wasn't there, it was possible he left behind some clue about what he'd uncovered. When Reggie arrived, the building was dark except for a single light glowing from the corner office. He parked his car and approached cautiously, his instincts on high alert. Inside, the office was eerily quiet. The light he'd seen was coming from Harris' desk, where a lamp illuminated a stack of open files. But the detective was nowhere to be seen. Reggie's eyes scanned the room, taking in the scattered papers, the half-empty coffee cup, and a laptop that was still powered on but locked. Something had interrupted Harris mid-task, and whatever it was, it didn't feel voluntary. Reggie moved to the desk and began to sift through the papers. There were records of financial transactions, personnel files from the precinct, and a list of names that sent a chill down his spine. Some of the names were familiar, officers he'd been observing at the precinct. But others were new, including one name he hadn't expected to see, Captain Willis. The documents painted a picture of something much deeper than individual misconduct. This wasn't just a culture of bad behavior. It was a coordinated effort to protect certain officers while targeting others. There were payoffs, falsified reports, and evidence of a network that extended beyond the precinct, possibly reaching into city leadership. The deeper Reggie looked, the more he realized how far the corruption went. As he gathered the documents, a sudden sound broke the silence, a faint creak, like someone stepping on loose floorboards. Reggie froze, his senses on high alert. He turned off the desk lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and waited. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone else was in the building. Reggie moved quickly and quietly, slipping into the shadows. His pulse quickened as he heard footsteps approaching the office. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide their presence. The deliberate pace of their steps suggested confidence, as if they believed they had nothing to fear. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light from the hallway. Reggie recognized the uniform immediately. It was one of the officers from the precinct, though he couldn't make out who it was in the dim light. The officer paused, scanning the room, then stepped inside. Reggie stayed hidden, his mind racing. This wasn't a random encounter. Someone had sent this officer here, likely to retrieve whatever Harris had uncovered. But why send someone in uniform? It was a bold move, almost brazen, as if they believed no one would dare question them. The officer moved to the desk, rifling through the papers Reggie had just been examining. They muttered something under their breath, frustration evident in their movements. Reggie held his breath, waiting for the right moment. When the officer turned toward the laptop, Reggie stepped out of the shadows. Looking for something, he asked, his voice calm but firm. The officer spun around, their hand instinctively reaching for their sidearm. But when they saw who it was, they hesitated. "You," they said, their voice a mix of surprise and annoyance. Reggie took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "I could ask you the same thing," he said. "What are you doing here?" The officer's eyes darted to the papers on the desk, then back to Reggie. "I could ask you the same thing," they said, attempting to regain control of the situation. Reggie smirked faintly, his gaze unwavering. "Let's not play games. You're here for the same reason I am, to find out what Harris uncovered. So why don't we skip the theatrics and have an honest conversation?" The officer didn't respond immediately, but their posture shifted, tension radiating off them. It was clear they were weighing their options, deciding whether to confront Reggie or back down. After a moment, they straightened up, their expression hardening. "You don't know what you're getting into," they said, echoing Captain Willis's earlier warning. "This isn't your fight." Reggie tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You're right," he said. "It's not just my fight. It's a fight for every person who's been hurt by the system you're protecting. And I'm not walking away." The officer's jaw tightened, but before they could respond, a sudden noise from outside the office interrupted them, a car engine roaring to life, followed by the screech of tires. Reggie's instincts kicked in, and he bolted for the window. He caught a glimpse of a dark sedan speeding away, its taillights disappearing into the night. Who was that? Reggie demanded, turning back to the officer. But the officer didn't answer. Instead, they moved toward the door, their steps hurried. Reggie considered stopping them, but decided against it. There were bigger questions to answer, and he needed to focus on the bigger picture. As the office fell silent again, Reggie stood alone in the dim light, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Harris was still missing. The documents he found hinted at a conspiracy larger than he'd anticipated, and now it was clear that someone was willing to go to great lengths to keep the truth buried. Reggie knew the clock was ticking. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the full picture was still just out of reach. And with each passing moment, The stakes were growing higher. Whatever was coming next, it would push everything to the brink. Reggie drove back to the precinct with his mind racing, the weight of what he discovered pressing heavily on his chest. The names, the transactions, and the web of corruption. It all pointed to something bigger, something carefully orchestrated. But Harris was still missing, and the documents alone wouldn't be enough without someone willing to testify. Reggie knew he was walking into dangerous territory, but there was no turning back now. When he arrived at the precinct, the atmosphere felt off. The air was tense, and the usual buzz of activity seemed muted, as though everyone was holding their breath. Reggie walked in with a purposeful stride, his expression betraying none of the turmoil inside him. He could feel eyes on him, the officers watching closely, sensing that something was about to happen. He went straight to Captain Willis's office, pushing the door open without knocking. Willis looked up, his face darkening at the intrusion. "What now, Parker?" he asked, his tone dripping with annoyance. Reggie closed the door behind him and placed the stack of documents on Willis's desk. "You've got some explaining to do," he said, his voice steady but firm. Willis glanced at the papers but didn't reach for them. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Careful, Parker," he said. "You're treading on thin ice." "Thin ice," Reggie repeated, his tone sharp. "That's funny, coming from a man whose name is all over these files. Payoffs, cover-ups, and God knows what else. This isn't thin ice, Willis. This is the end of the line." Willis's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he stared at Reggie. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence crackling with tension. Then Willis leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can waltz in here and play hero? You don't know what you're dealing with." "Enlighten me," Reggie shot back. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you and your buddies have been using this precinct as your personal playground. But the game's over." Willis smirked, a cold, humorless expression. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you?" he said, "but you're missing the bigger picture. This isn't about me or you. It's about power, Parker. The kind of power you can't touch." Reggie stared at him, his mind racing. The confidence in Willis's voice wasn't bravado. It was something else, something rooted in certainty. Before Reggie could respond, there was a knock at the door. Both men turned as the door opened, revealing Officer Dawson. "Parker," Dawson said, his voice urgent. "We need to talk. Now." Reggie nodded, his eyes flicking back to Willis. "Don't go anywhere," he said before following Dawson into the hallway. Once they were out of earshot, Dawson turned to him, his expression tense.
"They found Harris," Dawson said. Reggie's heart skipped a beat. "Where is he? Is he okay?" Dawson hesitated, then shook his head. "He's in the hospital. Someone roughed him up pretty bad. But before they got to him, he managed to call in a favor. He left a message for you." Reggie's stomach tightened as Dawson handed him a slip of paper with an address scribbled on it. "What's this?" he asked. "Some kind of storage unit," Dawson said. "Harris said it's where he hid the rest of the evidence. He wanted you to have it." Reggie nodded, tucking the paper into his pocket. "Thanks, Dawson. I owe you." "You don't owe me anything," Dawson said. "Just be careful. Whoever did this to Harris won't think twice about coming after you." Reggie drove to the address with a sense of urgency, his mind racing with possibilities. When he arrived, the storage facility was dark and quiet, the rows of units stretching into the shadows. He found the one Harris had indicated and unlocked it, stepping inside to find a small table with a laptop and a file box. He opened the laptop and found a video file queued up. Clicking play, he watched as Harris appeared on the screen, his face bruised but his voice steady. "If you're watching this, it means I didn't make it in time," Harris said. "But the truth is here. Everything you need to take them down is in this folder. Use it wisely." Reggie opened the file box and found a treasure trove of evidence, emails, bank records, photos, and recordings. It was enough to dismantle the entire operation. But as he flipped through the files, something caught his eye, a name he hadn't expected to see. One of the key players in the corruption ring wasn't just Captain Willis. It was someone higher up, someone with the power to bury everything. It was the deputy mayor. Reggie felt a cold rush of anger as the pieces fell into place. The corruption wasn't confined to the precinct. It reached into the very fabric of the city. And now he was holding the proof. As he left the storage unit, his mind racing with the implications, he noticed a car parked down the street, its headlights off. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Reggie got into his car and drove away, taking a circuitous route back to his apartment. He couldn't risk leading whoever was following him to the evidence. When he finally made it home, he locked the door behind him and set the file box on the table. As he reviewed the materials, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You've gone too far. Back off, or there will be consequences." Reggie stared at the message, his resolve hardening. The game was over. It was time to bring the truth into the light, no matter the cost. Reggie sat in his dimly lit apartment, the file box open on the table, surrounded by the mountain of evidence Harris had risked everything to gather. The text message still glowed ominously on his phone screen, a stark reminder of the danger he was in. But Reggie knew there was no turning back now. Too many lives had been affected by the corruption he'd uncovered, and the truth needed to come out, no matter the cost. He spent the night organizing the evidence, carefully documenting each piece. Every bank transfer, every falsified report, every conversation secretly recorded by Harris. It all painted a damning picture of a network that spanned the precinct, city officials, and beyond. The deputy mayor's involvement was the linchpin, tying the corruption to the highest levels of power. Reggie understood that exposing this would be like lighting a fuse. The fallout would be massive. As dawn broke, Reggie made his move. He sent copies of the evidence to multiple sources, trusted reporters, internal affairs, and a few key allies in the department who he believed were still on the right side of the law. He knew this wasn't just about confronting the guilty. It was about ensuring the truth couldn't be silenced. By the time he arrived at the precinct later that morning, the atmosphere was electric. Officers whispered in hushed tones, their gazes shifting nervously as Reggie walked through the halls. It didn't take long for Captain Willis to summon him to his office, and Reggie went willingly, knowing what was coming. Willis was waiting, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "What do you think you're doing, Parker?" he demanded, slamming a hand on his desk. "You're throwing this entire department under the bus." Reggie met his gaze without flinching. "No," he said calmly. "I'm throwing you under the bus. You and everyone else who thinks they're untouchable. This stops now." Willis's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Reggie thought the man might lash out. But instead, Willis leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You think you've won," he said. "You're in over your head, Parker. The people you're messing with won't just roll over and let this happen." Reggie stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Maybe they won't, but the evidence is already out there. The press, internal affairs, they all have it. There's no covering this up." Willis's smirk faltered, and for the first time, Reggie saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. Without another word, Reggie turned and walked out, leaving the captain to stew in his own guilt. The fallout was swift and far-reaching. Within hours, news outlets were reporting on the scandal, their headlines filled with phrases like systemic corruption and citywide conspiracy. Internal Affairs launched a full-scale investigation, and several officers were placed on administrative leave, including Willis. The deputy mayor was publicly named as a central figure in the scandal, and the pressure on city leadership grew by the minute. Reggie watched it all unfold with a mix of relief and exhaustion. He knew this was only the beginning. Accountability would take time, and the fight to rebuild trust in the department would be long and difficult. But for the first time in months, he felt a sense of hope. Later that evening, Reggie visited Harris in the hospital. The detective was sitting up in bed, his face bruised but his spirit unbroken. When he saw Reggie walk in, he managed a weak smile. "You did it," he said. "You actually did it." Reggie pulled up a chair and sat down. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You're the real hero in all this." Harris chuckled softly, wincing as the movement tugged at his injuries. "Hero, huh? I don't feel like one. But if it means those bastards finally get what's coming to them, maybe it's worth it." Reggie nodded, the weight of everything that had happened settling on his shoulders. "It's worth it," he said, "but we've got a long road ahead." Over the next few weeks, the city grappled with the fallout of the scandal. Protests erupted, demanding accountability and reform. Community leaders and activists called for greater oversight of law enforcement, and the mayor promised sweeping changes to address the systemic issues that had allowed the corruption to thrive. Within the department, a new sense of purpose began to take hold. Officers who had stayed silent in the face of wrongdoing started speaking up, and a handful of younger recruits emerged as leaders, determined to rebuild the community's trust. Reggie found himself at the center of these efforts, not because he wanted to be, but because people looked to him as someone who had refused to back down when it mattered most. One evening, as Reggie sat at his desk going through paperwork, Dawson stopped by, leaning against the doorframe. "Big changes happening around here," Dawson said, a hint of a smile on his face. Reggie glanced up, his expression tired but content. "Yeah," he said, "about time." Dawson stepped inside, his tone turning serious. "You know, not everyone would have done what you did. It takes guts to stand up to your own, especially when the stakes are that high." Reggie shrugged. "It wasn't about guts," he said. "It was about doing what was right. That's what this job is supposed to be about." Dawson nodded, a look of respect in his eyes. "Well, if we're lucky, maybe more people will start seeing it that way." As the weeks turned into months, the department began to transform. Policies were implemented to increase transparency and accountability, and new leadership brought a renewed focus on serving the community. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of hope. Reggie knew the fight wasn't over. Corruption didn't disappear overnight, and there would always be challenges to face. But as he stood on the steps of the precinct one evening, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The text message he'd received that night remained in his mind, a reminder of the risks he'd taken and the enemies he'd made. But he also knew that the truth was out there now, and no threat could take that away. For Reggie, the journey had been one of loss, betrayal, and sacrifice. But it had also been a journey of redemption, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, doing the right thing could light the way forward.